So I was researching some videos and I was looking around and I was tappity tapping away and I found the best article. I totally found the best article, and it's actually on the Sydney Morning Herald. Jack Lattimore, January the 8th, 2022. Now Paul Farrell, pay attention. This guy's actually got some brains. He actually did some research that put several parties on the page and linked several of their actions together, and he's somewhat not wrong. So maybe you should follow in his footsteps, Mr. Paul Farrell, at the four corners of the gay BC. So that's read along time, like little story times. Once upon a time, by the Sydney Morning Herald, published 1 year ago. Blackfishing. Blackfishing. Alt-right pushes to co-opt Aboriginal tent embassy to the cause. So that's the title, everybody. Title of today's story. For the Aboriginal tent embassy on the banks of Lake Burley Griffin in the national capital, this is a milestone year. Celebrations will begin later this month to mark the 50th continuous year of occupation of a site originally set up to demand land rights, the protection of sacred sites, and proper compensation for the land not returned. Hit the nail on the head, Mr. Jack Lattimore. The embassy is heritage listed and the world's longest standing protest. But before it can celebrate, its current occupiers must endure what amounts to an attempted hostile takeover by a coalition of alt-right freedom groups rifling on notions of sovereignty markedly different to the sovereignty sought by most Aboriginal people. Over the past 2 weeks, tensions have exploded into action and public consciousness after a group of people purporting to be conducting a traditional smoking ceremony under the historic portico of the old Parliament House set fire to its doors. I mean, who lights a fire underneath the roof of something? I lit one of the largest smoking ceremonies on the eastern seaboard and filled the valley with smoke for almost 10 days. And there was no way in hell I would have lit that fire underneath the awning of the front door of a building. I mean, these fires need to be so hot that they burn smoke out rather than flames. So it's kind of silly. So it's irresponsible and negligent to see that any kind of elder would do this. I know Uncle Gilbert would never do this kind of stupid. So, but where were we? The fire, which Victorian Greens MP Lydia Thorpe initially appeared to celebrate before reversing herself, caused damage that Museum of Australia Democracy Director Darryl Karp says may be unfixable. Soot covered many parts of the building and caused the building's sprinkler system to go off, damaging original flooring. 5 people are facing charges over the incident. Now, the charges here in relation to attacking a Parliament House when being caught in the specific environment in which they've been caught is considered to be serious offence at law. Like, some of these charges face 25-year jail sentences, and you'll see the leniency at which they've been given because it seeks to perform a government modus operandi. A statement issued by the Embassy Council on December 30th condemning the smoking ceremony said it was done without the knowledge, consent, or mandate of the Embassy Council and traditional owners responsible for the regulation of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Bullshit. And then there's this photo, Green Senator Lydia Thorpe at the Tent Embassy last year, walking across in the rain with a little kangaroo skin on, acting like she's an Aboriginal, but she's actually a protester, an activist. Earlier this week, the Freedom Protest Group formed a campsite on the grounds outside the National Portrait Museum, the same area containing the cafe restaurant where protesters trapped then Prime Minister Julia Gillard and opposition leader Tony Abbott after Abbott said it was time to move the embassy on. On Thursday, a heavy police presence forcibly evicted them, pushing back towards the embassy. So they've gone and planted themselves on another lawn, and you do remember the Gillard shoe incident where Gillard was rushed out of the cafe as well. So they're in a place that has hosted generations of Aboriginal activists. The protest has effectively split into two divisions, one camp containing the Tent Embassy and an increasingly larger group behind and to the side of it in what is called the Rose Garden area. And this kind of led to this 2022 election where the sound weapons came out and all the flags problems and all the Aboriginal problems. Donna, do you remember ringing me? Do you remember that problem that was like screaming people in the background on your phone call? Yeah, I remember all of it. Right, so there is, in a place that has hosted generations of Aboriginal activists, the protest has effectively split into two divisions. The newcomers are an iteration of a growing US-influenced protest movement in Australia that is trying to legitimise its various agendas by co-opting Indigenous people and issues through a process activists and academics have termed Blackfishing. Wow, that's a new term for me. I didn't know this term existed, Mr. Jack Lattimore. That's a very interesting term, Blackfishing. So Lydia's been blackfished by the Soros Foundation BLM type people, and the blackfishing has infected the Parliament of the Commonwealth in communist style sort of agenda. Isn't that right, Elbow? Isn't that right, Elbow? Far out. So we have this term blackfishing, right, which now describes the whole Lydia thing in the Parliament, right? That they first turned up at the Tent Embassy in early December, and according to Ngunnawal elder Matilda House Williams, speaking to the Canberra Times, there's a whole ton of them. There's a whole ton of them. There's a whole ton of these conspiracy theorists that aren't Ngunnawal elder Matilda House Williams' family. When the police forcibly moved them on, they responded with QAnon-style phrases such as, "You're a non-player character," and "pedophile protectors, you're a non-player character." Now, that's sort of a synonym to the gaming industry, where you have non-player characters in your game and you're the first player character. And this is not a American ideology. That's an online ideology of people that are too stupid to do anything of their own volition. Video posts by some of the group's adherent and influencers, as well as its alt-right supporters, reveal how gaining control of the Tent Embassy is only a stepping stone in a more ambitious scheme. They want to take the chair of Old Parliament House itself. Old Parliament House itself. They want to take the chair of a museum. Yeah, it does have a line of authority to the King of Australia established on the Supreme Court record, but there's also a new Parliament up the hill there, and you wouldn't think you'd use an old building if there was a fancy new one to use. You might use the old one as a museum and put all your history in there, where you might recognise those Aboriginal kings. Right, so if you go into that museum and have a good look around, you might find evidence of Aboriginal kings in that king's building. Pretty interesting thought that would be. And despite a number of arrests after the disastrous smoking ceremony, it appears that they are here to stay. Yeah, it's because there's a conglomerate of retarded peoples that like to follow this stuff on Facebookies, right? And they don't realise that New South Wales police feed a lot of this information into these tards' heads so that they believe this stuff so they can be swept up by the police in the first place. And despite a number of arrests after the disastrous smoking ceremony, it appears they are there to stay. Daily call-outs are now being made for freedom supporters, supporters to converge on the nation's capital, to join them. And this was where the 2022 election and everything was starting to rev up, and Bossy brought the flag, and Carlton brought the flag, and UAP did the flag thing, and we already saw the UAP thing and the sovereign citizens and the selling of the flag, and they're just making money off people because that's what they do. They have no interest in actual reality or truths. They're activists that want some sort of agenda that goes their way at the cost of everyone else. Original sovereigns, no such thing. At the head of the new protest group is Marawiri and budgety environmental activist Bruce Shillingsworth, whose prominent activism around water shortages and related issues in the Murray-Darling Basin have been nationally lauded. Around him are several Indigenous men and women already prominently involved in the alt-right freedom movement rallies in Sydney and Melbourne. None would speak to The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. There's no surprises there. It'd be rather embarrassing to be spoken to by someone of intellect that might question them on a few things that they may not know the answers to. Shillingsworth was closely associated with the respected Yuin elder and cultural lawman Uncle Max Harrison, who was allied with the vaccine-skeptical Information Medical Options Party and the broader freedom movement before his sudden COVID-related death in early December. So we need to double check that. Is that an actual reality? Was he jibby-jabbied or did he refuse to be jibby-jabbied? And what were the circumstances? Was he drunk? Was he not a drunk? What? Was he a strong man? Was he a weak man? Oh, I don't know. Uncle Max addressed the Millions March rally in Sydney 2 weeks before he died in a COVID ward at the Sutherland Hospital. That means nothing to me. Could be the Shangri-La ward at the Boo Boo Hospital for all I care. It doesn't describe what he died from. Shillingsworth and his group, Black and White, have called via social media videos for the broader sovereign citizens movement, as well as the Indigenous original sovereigns groups around the country to converge on Canberra in convoys. Now, remember that was Rebel Without a Cause, because they caused the truck convoy thingy in Canada, and Lydia talked about her brothers and sisters across the seas, right? So remember that South Africa had its parliament door burnt down as well, right? So these sovereign citizen movements are pretty well known by the establishment, I would think, because I've been questioned very hard about it myself. So, having not been a sovereign citizen, played a different game to this whole entire ideology of politics and activism. We played the law. instead. When police moved them away from the portrait gallery on Thursday, they responded with QAnon-style phrases such as, "You're non-player characters," and "pedophile protectors." Indigenous members of the group demanded the police prove their jurisdiction over the area with deeds and titles. And Shillingsworth repeatedly demanded that $100 trillion in taxpayer gold be transferred to his personal bank account for breaches of a pseudo-legal contract he attempted to serve on senior officers. The delusion of not knowing what a contract is and being able to sort of push an ideology to prove certain things false, but at the same time stand to something that might be true. This is just all pseudo-legal theory and a load of codswallop, and has got them all in a lot of trouble, and we're going to see that in this article as we go through. A series of virtual meetings between prominent Indigenous group members and non-Indigenous alt-right activists suggest a plot to effectively copy the US Capitol Hill insurrection. For the Australian version, the target is Old Parliament House. No, it's not. That's where you sort of got this slightly bit wrong, Jack Lattimore. You're starting to see a little bit more of it today, with Lydia's face cracking as she plays around and rallies and tanties like a child, and it's starting to crack now in the actual parliament as the laws are starting to fall down in place over what you all actually have done. So that's a real hard pill to swallow that's coming forward. That you can't escape all this shit. And there are some serious and harsh consequences involved in all this shit. And you know that because you played this stupid game with me for almost a decade. So, where were we? They believe the quasi-mystical locus of power in Australia is invested in the seat of the old parliament, because that is the address listed on the ABN registrations of the Commonwealth's Economy and Trade Departments. That's a bit silly, right? That might be administration of those economy and trade departments, but the seat is listed in section 125 of the Constitution, the King's seat of government, right? And that's clearly defined in the Constitution itself, and I'm pretty sure that most of these parliamentary members are following that kind of book, mostly to the letter. I wouldn't say all to the letter, but mostly to the letter, because they're under administration. That's probably why they installed an Administration Accountability Act 2013, to keep them accountable in that administration. Right. The new Parliament House, the seat of federal government since 1988, is pretend, they say, and the government's jurisdiction fiction. Well, what if I put it to you that both Parliament Houses were the same Parliament House and they were both the same seat of government, and one formed a museum of history to both? Because it forms the seat of government under section 125 of the Constitution, making the whole entire complex the keyhole to government. And you'll clearly see that on the signs as you walk around the entire grounds where you actually are at that time. Over the past fortnight, Shillingsworth has identified himself as a regional sovereign, a local variation of the International Free Man on the Land movement. The International Free Man on the Land movement. The International Free Man on the Land movement. So this is where Jack sort of is steered a slightly bit wrong, but he's not wrong. He's kind of not wrong, because that's kind of what these people do actually believe. So, alright, shuffling around, where were we? Over the past fortnight, Shillingsworth has identified himself as an original sovereign, a local variation of the International Free Man on the Land movement. Many of the planning meetings tied to the new protest group involved Indigenous man David Cole, also known as Learnpa, a leading figure in the original Sovereign Tribal Federation, which was established by non-Indigenous man Mark McMurtry, aka Gunambari Jakamara, after he was impressed in 2009 by the pseudo-legal counsel of David Wynn Miller, an American retired tool and die welder and self-appointed King of Hawaii. Self-appointed. That's a very clear distinction here. And Mark High, remember that there's a history there. So now we have a picture of January the 6th and the American flag and the protesters of the alt-right, and that went through all the criminal trials and everything. We spoke about that in a previous video. Last year, the Age and Herald revealed the collaboration between the original Sovereign Tribal Federation and former One Nation Senator Rod Cullerton, who at the time was trying to establish a right-wing political party in former alliance with Indigenous Sovereign Citizen Movement. Well, that kind of flowed into Clive Palmer's little party with Craig Kelly and the flying of that federal red ensign along with Rodney Cullerton. And then Bossy came along and said, oh, everyone should put that flag down and fly this new flag that came from these rich people in Western Australia. And everyone went, boo, Bossy, put your flag down and go away. Boo, Bossy. And then the Aboriginals rang Steve and said, what do we do? And Steve said, go back to the fucking tent embassy and stay away from all these tards that are pretending to play all this stupid shit. And they went back to the tent embassy. And then the cops brought the sound weapons and the pepper spray out. Remember all of that? Right? And that was all at the hands of Rodney Cullerton, Craig Kelly, the Aborigine of this Sovereign Tribal Federation, the other part of this sovereign activism, right? And this guy, Jack Lattimore, has pretty much nailed it all together. He's not wrong, he's pretty close, right? He's pretty close. So as we read on, in the United States, sovereign citizens are regarded by the Justice Department as a domestic terrorism threat after several armed actions in which law enforcement officers and civilian men, women and children have been killed. They do not have the same label in Australia. Well, I'd call that complete bullshit, considering that you framed us for being a terrorist organisation and the Supreme Court of New South Wales had to define us as a non-terrorist organisation. Might be the reason why we don't appear in this article in any way, shape or form, because we're not party to all of this activist communist stupidity that Albo's got himself involved in. Right, Moses and the pandemic law. On December 30th, video posted to social media accounts run by members of Our Sovereign Citizens group showed demonstrators banging on the doors of Old Parliament House, which is now run as a museum. Shillingsworth's son, known as Buddy, and Bunjalong woman Cindy Roberts, aka Widjadul Dubai, were among them. Police made 5 arrests in the days after the fire. One who was arrested, released on bail, arrested again, released again, was Nicholas Reed, who is accused of carrying numerous armful and kindling and several Coolaman loads of hot coals to the front of Old Parliament House. The ACT court was told he had been shown in posts on social media stoking the fire. Now, before we go on with this article, I turned up to Parliament House and I walked in the doors and the lady said to me, that'll be $17, thanks. And I just turned around to the lady and said, look, I ain't paying to go into my own building. Like, why would I pay to go into my own building? And I thought she was going to throw me out with some security guards. And the next thing I know, I've got two tour guides there willing to give me a fully guided tour of my museum. My museum that you burnt the door down of, instead of realising that it was your museum too, because inside there were evidences of Aboriginal kings. So Nicholas Malcolm Reid leaves the courts this week wearing his COVID mask. Reid, a white man, you know, like not Caucasian, a white man, who also goes by the tribal name, allegedly has separate pending legal matters in Victoria, and is crowdfunding online for the Jabwurrung Sovereign Tribal Government Fund, a campaign purportedly to benefit the Jabwurrung people located in Victoria's Western District. The most recent campaign raised $3,759. So there's your activism, raising funds for pretend peoples in some pretend location so that he can pay his legal matters off. He's not open to the fact, like, yeah, I'm going to court, might need some help paying for this shit, going to fight the establishment, will fight the establishment, give me a hand helping me to pay for all of this shit. Everybody would have just been like, yeah, cool, here's $5. Right? But instead, you've got to lie to everybody about some bullshit government fund or some bullshit government court or some, you know, like, this is the activism lie that we're watching unfold in front of us in the Parliament right now. So, reading on. The Australian has reported that Reid's bail rules included that he live at an address which, according to property records, is owned by Business Council of Australia President Tim Reid and his wife, Carola Brent, a former Lane Cove councillor on Sydney's North Shore. Tim Reid declined to comment. Is that your son, Tim? Is Nicholas Malcolm Reid the son of some influential North Shore business types that used to be councillors on the North Shore in Lane Cove, where I used to live? That's kind of interesting. That's kind of interesting, given we know the kind of things that were going on around that region in the time period. Among others, in attendance at the fire, though not arrested, was Roberts, who in a video interview with Tartaria Australia on December 10 said she saw herself as Moses on the forecourt of Parliament House before revealing that she had intended to knock the locks off the doors, enter and reclaim what was rightfully hers. How in any way was the Parliament of something that had nothing to do with you rightfully yours? And I'm pretty sure there's a £300 receipt for the land of which the Parliament House was actually built on. So I'm pretty sure they paid for the land that was not rightfully hers. This week, police made 2 more arrests in the area known as Parliamentary Triangle. Well, we call it the keyhole because on all the maps there it's a keyhole. One was of Buddy Shillingworth for outstanding warrants related to past driving offences. The other was a white man named Dylan Didge Wilson from the New South Wales Northern Rivers, a self-described land law marshal recognised by a circle of elders across this continent. Both were later released. This is a man that the AFP asked me about and the CIB asked me about. This very man, Dylan Didge Wilson. And all I know about him is that he's on the old Facebooks doing the activism, pushing his bullshit around everywhere that we're starting to see crack right in front of us. But the arrests and the charges are not the end of it. On Sunday, a strong cohort is expected to arrive from Victoria many motivated by ongoing opposition to Victoria Premier Daniel Andrews. Yeah, well, he is a Nazi piece of shit, so that's kind of understandable. Whose government succeeded in changing the state's pandemic response legislation late in the year after weeks of protests by anti-vax and anti-lockdown groups on the steps of Spring Street. Among the props taken to protests were an apparently operational gallows. We all remember that. But here's the thing that I'd like to point out to our little writer for the Sydney Morning Herald, Jack Lattimore. Those are really legally binding things that you've kind of made accusations of that you should, as a journalist, not even be saying. That's just stupid shit you just said, and it kind of says that you're pro-government and that you're a government lackey, because anybody that says a protest by anti-vax and anti-lockdown groups, right, that just in its own wording defines that you're against some sort of narrative that you're for. And that's the wording in your article that you need to learn how to not do, right? Just because it's the government narrative that, or you have to use the word anti-vax in your article somewhere. I'll change that protest group to anti-vax protest group, right? No, that's probably your editor in that respect. So we carry on. Several posts to social media among this group have expressed anger at a decision by a court in Myrtle, Victoria, in which the protesters had invested high hopes that Andrew would be found guilty of treason. These posts encouraged supporters to head to Canberra, right, in which the protesters had invested high hopes that a man under a foreign crown in administration of the Commonwealth of Australia under the Australia Act by a state of Victoria is going to be found guilty of treason when he's following the command of a military command above him. That's pretty funny. He should be found guilty of the international war crimes under Rule 90 and Rule 92 of the international humanitarian law that he committed as administrator on this soil. But that's a different story to protesting and being retarded about what you think. No place, title. When Senator Thorpe tweeted on the day of the fire, "Seems like the colonial system is burning down. Happy New Year, everyone." It seemed like the action might have broader significance in the Aboriginal protest community than it did. Thorpe later removed the tweet and this week told The Age and the Herald, "I stand in solidarity with the Tent Embassy. The people responsible for the fire have disrespected blah 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 traditional owners, the people that traded the land to the Crown. There is no place for anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists in the struggle for First Nations sovereignty." So someone said to her, pull your head in and use this in a different way. Or she knew what the fuck she was doing and she went out like a twat and then came back and turned it around into the political, parliamentary privilege that this is. First Nations sovereignty never existed, Lydia. You show me a constitution, you show me a map, you show me all these things that nations have so that you can be nations and self-determine. Oh, you failed to do that, didn't you, Lydia? Self-described to you in your own words. Right? Back at the Tent Embassy, some key representatives are too nervous of the newcomers to speak on the record, but Ngunnawal and Nambi, traditional owners and senior figures, why do we call them traditional owners? Why don't we call them tribal elders? Because that's what they are, right? I'm getting sick of calling them things that they're not. They're tribal elders on a land that is their own land, but is no longer their land in the military sense. It doesn't stop them from being tribal elders living on their own country. For fuck's sake, I'm over this traditional owner bullshit. And senior figures from the earliest Tent Embassy protest cohorts of 1970 to 1973 have spoken out about the failure of the new group of protesters to observe cultural protocol and abstain obtain consent to conduct their ceremonies on the site. Obtain consent. Obtain consent. Please ask us to do the things you want to do. We're the masters of you. Fuck off. Right? Just do your thing. And then let them do their thing, because their thing turned into activism and all that stupid shit, and they'll get charged for it. And in the long run, it's being found out that they're directly trying to attack and undermine things, and it's going to be at their own demise. So this whole entire, I control you, needs to stop. We saw it in the video between the two elders opening the bridge. This is my land. Well, fuck off. Meanwhile, at the federal government announced it would establish a $316.5 million Indigenous Cultural Centre with the Parliamentary Triangle nearby the area where the embassy stands. So we're already committed to throwing a whole bunch more, like a third of $1 billion, right? Which is throw more billions at them. Is that the answer? Elbow, throw more billions at the protesters. Keep them happy. Right, give them more land. Give them more land. You're a disgrace, Elbow. You're a disgrace, government. Right, you've caused all of these problems on everybody on behalf of a bunch of whining twat protesters. They are trying to prepare for the demonstrations and cultural ceremonies which will mark the golden anniversary. The work, they told the Age and the Herald, was an assertion of commitment to the legacy of the embassy. Well, if it was their embassy, they'd pay for it, right? But it's not. It's the Australian government's embassy, because the Australian government threw $316.5 million at it. And in that case, it can't be in any way diplomatic. It can't be in any way self-determined, because the Australian government's paying these protesters to continue this retarded shit. Prominent First Nations that were never nations activist group Warriors of Aboriginal Resistance, WAR, war, this is war, is clear, though, on the question of sovereignty and the attempt by the original sovereign movement to co-opt the First Nations sovereignty rights movement, according to a spokesperson, Gamilarara and Kuma woman Ruby Wharton. The biggest difference between First Nation sovereignty and that being claimed by the sovereign citizen movement was simple, she said. Sovereignty is our birthright. Yeah, it is. Get the fuck out of our constitution. Stop taking the handouts. Stop taking the $316.5 million. Stand on your own 2 feet. Raise your own funds. Defend yourselves with your own defence force. Police your own children. Stop allowing all of this shit to occur on our land and go about your own business. This is the problem. They can't. They always want what you've got, because they're not self-determined, are they? That they're always leaning off of you. The biggest difference between First Nation sovereignty and that being claimed by the sovereign citizen movement is the fact that they're all citizens under the Citizenship Act 1973. It's our birthright to occupy our traditional homelands. Well, traditional means traded, means you gave them away. Whereas you should have said, it's our birthright to occupy our homelands. It's our birthright to speak our language. It's our birthright to practice our traditional laws. No, it's our birthright to practice our laws and practice and protect our country. So if I was to say this and say it completely different to you, it's our birthright to occupy our homeland. It's our birthright to speak our language. It's our birthright to practice our law. And to protect our country. The sovereignty these other people talk of is sovereignty away from the crown, which is totally delusional. Sovereignty away from the crown, which is totally delusional. Because the only way these white people have sovereignty in this country is through the crown. So let's just think about this for a second as we go over this very last paragraph again. because the last sentence says, it's delusional for any kind of comparison to be drawn here. It's absolutely not the same and never will be. It's our birthright. So the biggest difference between First Nations sovereignty and that being claimed by the sovereign citizen movement was simple, she said. Sovereignty is our birthright. Are you saying that it's not my birthright as King of Australia? Are you saying it's not my birthright as the House of Spires? Are you saying it's not my son's birthright having been born here? Those are very stark claims that you make in relation to sovereign citizens who are just deluded people who have no idea of the crown. And then it says, it's our birthright to occupy our traditional lands. Well, it's our birthright to occupy our constituted lands. Same thing, isn't it? It's our birthright to speak language. Well, it's our birthright to speak English, or Australianised English, right? Slang. It's our birthright to practice our traditional laws. Well, it's our birthright to practice our constitutional and biblical scriptural laws. Same thing, right? The sovereignty these other people talk of is the sovereignty away from the crown. The sovereignty these other people talk of is the sovereignty away from the crown. No, it's not. The sovereignty we talk of is in the Australian Imperial Crown defined on the Supreme Court of New South Wales court record in 2021. Separate to that of the St Edward's Crown, they are an occupying curial power. And in the matter, we are the occupied, not the sovereign citizen. The sovereignty these other people talk of is sovereignty away from the crown, which is totally delusional, because the only way these white people have sovereignty in this country is through the crown. And that's where we get to the point of the court record. Which crown? Which king? Which stone? Which flag? Problem. Because this is now describing the whole entire background to this whole scenario of the burning of the Parliament door down and this communist agenda that involves multiple countries and multiple movements all backed by the same sort of financial powers, and that modus operandi to seed and undermine the constitutions of several governments, being South Africa, Canada, Australia, and the United States, and possibly England too, but there's no tribal game to be played on the English soil, so they just invade it with foreign immigration. And that's the problem that we're having here at the moment, is that the government's currently pushing for more immigration, knowing that we as white Australian, constitutional Australia, might actually join hands with Aborigine Australia and realise what's going on and become one common force against the real problem that came here in 1967. And if that were to hit the fore, the legal ramifications for all of these war criminals could possibly be carried out. But it's kind of interesting to me that Jack Lattimore has named some of the players very well and linked this all together quite well and demonstrated an overseas tie and also demonstrated a insurrection and also demonstrated that this seeds all the way into the Parliament, and by my evidences can prove now that this whole entire referendum is a setup to destabilise the line of the executive branch power in your constitution, which can be found in a King of Australia, a prerogative right, and a line of authority in Anzac and a shrine of remembrance. And this is all can't be doubted now. It's all on the Supreme Court record. And what we look at now is all of these tryhards that have attempted to destabilise things for their own benefit instead of the fiduciary duty of the entire nation. Then this, I like this term, blackfishing. They got blackfished. They got blackfished. Elbow, did you get blackfished? That's a really good question, and I do like the term. Elbow got blackfished, or is Elbow doing the blackfishing?